Hello. Today in many mainline churches, Protestant churches at least, and I think the Presbyterian Church, it may be designated as what is called Stewardship Sunday. Mainly it means it's Sunday when we try to motivate people to dig deeper down into their pockets and pledge more money and give more money to keep the buildings open, the salaries paid, and some left over to give to the missions. And on this Sunday, it's also quite common that one of the usual texts is a little one from the Gospel, the story about the widow, the widow's mite, the widow putting in her last 2 copper coins. In Mark 12, it takes place probably around the temple, and it's really an indictment upon the scribes who walk around saying long prayers and who are also known for their long robes, always wanting the best seats, the banquet places. They were also like the temple bankers, temple lawyers. So the whole setting of that story takes place of Jesus' talk about this situation. And when there was this offering plate where people could put in some donations afterwards, a lot of the people walked by and some of the men said, this is the money that I'm putting in and this is how much it is and I want it to go for this and so forth. Well, finally a widow comes by and she just puts in the last 2 coins she has, couple copper coins. It's her whole wealth gone. And what Jesus is doing is not to really commending her because she gave everything she had, as if that's what we ought to be motivated to do. But what it is a story about the terrible injustice of the time then, and in many places in the world today, toward women, and especially toward widows. In the law of that day, and goes back 100 years before, women had no status. They were like slaves. They were like children. And so the only status that a woman had was being her attachment to a man. So at first she was attached as property of her father. And if she was lucky enough then to become married, then he would transfer her like property to another man's dominion, and sometimes with a little dowry along the way. It goes way back into the history of Israel. And so they were very vulnerable if after they were married, or perhaps their father died, they were single. And if they were a widow, many of them were reduced to being beggars. They had no status. And if a man didn't want them, they just wandered and they literally begged. And so it was very important for them to be identified with a man. But it was very unjust. It was a terrible, cruel way to support the treasury by having them confiscate her husband's properties and support their salaries. They were some of the richest people in the temple. In Jerusalem, where these scribes were, the temple bankers. So it's a story about injustice. Now, some of you know that as a Presbyterian, I'm kind of light on always hammering away at social injustice. I did a lot of that after I finished seminary in the 60s and the early 70s. And then I realized that in the scheme of things on this plane, in this world, in the whole universe, things will never be totally just. There's somebody that makes a little more than somebody else, and somebody that's a little better looking than somebody else. Somebody was born into a better place than another. And countries are always on this endless task to find a happy medium. What the Buddhists say is kind of the middle way. And when it gets too much out of balance, then it's trouble for everybody. And that's where all wars come from. That's where extreme poverty comes from. You see the warnings in the Old Testament book of Jeremiah, chapter 4, I believe. He warns that the whole nation Israel is about to collapse because of the way they're treating orphans and widows, some of the most vulnerable ones in society. There was a time in the Torah, back in Leviticus 24, I believe, that every 50 years, all debts had to be just absolved, and all indentured servants allowed to go free. It was kind of a leveling again of the ground. In the New Testament, we not only have verses like this from our Lord or Jesus, but we have denunciations of those who treat the widows also and the orphans unfairly. And then at one place Jesus makes this observation. that there will always, though, be wars and rumors of wars, and there will always be earthquakes and famines until the end of time. And we're still in that. So do as we may to try to make more level playing field. It's always an endless battle. But it's something we do to express and to spread that which is everlasting within each of us. But we do it in the kind of the middle way. Now in our country there's been a lot of division and fight about the inequalities. A country which was based on that equal right of all people to have liberty and justice and a fair trial, a fair hearing. But we know that from the very beginning that didn't include African Americans who were made hundreds of thousands in slaves. We know that didn't include Native Americans who were massacred and eliminated in genocide much more rapidly after the Constitution was ratified than it was before. We know that it didn't include women until, about 1918 they even had the right to vote. And even then they've been working to try to have equal worth, for equal pay, equal rights, because there's always that sense of somebody has to be special in order to be secure. And it's a lack of understanding that in our identities we're all children of God. But we forget that so quickly, getting identified to our forms. And in the last 30 years there's been again a dangerous shift in the minds of many from more of an equal nation to very unequal. For example, about 80% of all the wealth made since 1980, according to Forbes magazine and Stanford University study, about 80% of all wealth in the last 30 years has been shifted to the 1% in our country. That 1% in 1980 was making an average about 9% on its investments. Today it's making an average about 25%. And there's been this gross growing inequality, very dangerously so. Will it return to a more equal, a middle-class society as the hope and the dreams of so many were for so many years? I hope so, and I think so, but sometimes those changes are pretty bloody and violent. We doesn't have to be. If we realize that everybody has enough, we don't need billions and billions of dollars. We can share and still have plenty left. It will work. But I say that was a caution because there's always going to be wars and rumors of wars and famines and earthquakes and tsunamis that happen. It's a very imperfect world. But we do our part to work to see that there's a message of hope. First of all, that spiritually we are eternally secure forever, endowed with all the riches of eternity. And then seek to live that out in peace to others. Not in accumulation of wealth, but giving away as much as we can to help those who are the most vulnerable. Where does it start? It starts with me. It starts with you. Let me be a channel of your peace, St. Francis of Assisi said so many hundreds of years ago. And where there's discouragement and despair, let me bring hope. Let me bring resurrection where there is death. The way to peace, has been said, is peace itself. So whether it's a widow in distress or a child which is in distress, wherever there are starving people, there's work for us to do, but we do it in compassion, kindness, and forgiveness for ourselves, for our enemies, and for all, knowing that in the end, we all are one with the eternal Creator. Thank you for listening. God bless you with peace. Namaste to you all, as my divinity salutes and remembers yours.